In this treaty, we seek to establish freedom from aggression and from the use of force in the North Atlantic community. This is the area which has been at the heart of the last two world conflicts. To protect this area against war will be a long step toward permanent peace in the whole world.
From Mons and Brussels, Belgium, this is An Enduring Alliance, a podcast reflecting on the 70-year history of NATO and its oldest military headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. Welcome back to An Enduring Alliance, our podcast series on the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its oldest military headquarters, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE. Your hosts for today's episode are myself, U.S. Army Master Sergeant Alex Burnett, a SHAPE Media Operations Non-Commissioned Officer.
And I am Dr. Stella Adolf, the Chief Historical Advisor at SHAPE.
And I'm Dr. Linda Risso. I'm a History Consultant at SHAPE.
Building upon what we discussed in our previous episode, today we will look at how strategic plans work in practice and how NATO forces carried out exercises to improve their efficiency, readiness, and effectiveness. We will look again at the Cold War, but also the 1990s to show how NATO exercised in its new roles in the fields of peacekeeping and crisis management.
Before we start, we want to explain what military exercises are, their aim, and what form they take. And the answer is more complex than it may first appear.
The first and most obvious reason to hold military exercises is to train NATO forces and make them combat ready. Exercises help to retain skills and competencies and to acquire new ones. It is a train as you fight operation in peacetime.
Military exercises also allow soldiers to train with new technologies and weapon systems while integrating new operational concepts and force structures. They get acquainted with new tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs.
Military exercises go beyond straightforward military training. They are also tools of diplomacy and communication. For example, a successful NATO exercise is an expression of mutual trust and common resolve among the members. It boosts the alliance's common strategic vision.
Exercises are communication tools also in terms of deterrence. By holding a successful exercise, you send a message to potential adversaries. You show them what you're capable of. It is a way to project power and determination.
Military exercises are an effective means of strategic communication. For this reason, the design of exercises must be consistent with their strategic intent. There is always a risk that the adversary may misinterpret or misread an exercise, especially amidst rising tensions.
During the Cold War, NATO had a clear mission: to defend its members from a Soviet-led attack. It was believed at the time that the attack would come from the east.
Throughout the Cold War, NATO carried out alliance-wide exercises to reinforce collective defense and to deter. Exercises were, for example, a means to strengthen the high level of readiness of the forces stationed in the Central region.
We've asked Diego Reeves-Palmer, who appeared in previous episodes and has extensive experience in the planning of military exercises, to explain the challenges involved in the planning and executing of exercises during the Cold War.
NATO started running exercises almost immediately upon the establishment of SHAPE and the integrated military structure. From the start, there was a division of labor by which most NATO air and maritime exercises, most NATO air maritime exercises were run by the alliance, whereas most land-based field training exercises were run really by the individual nations. So, for instance, you had air exercises like crack force or coal fire, or maritime exercises like Dawn Patrol and Ocean Safari. Those were run by NATO headquarters. Land force exercises like the British Army's Spear Point, the Dutch Army Atlantic Lion, or the Belgian Army Golden Crown, those were run by the individual nations with the participation of other allies. Now, in addition to live exercises, NATO run computer-assisted and command post exercises, and battle staff training exercises, such as Central Fortress in the Central Region, which allowed commanders to review their plans and develop new operational concepts. And for instance, in the early 1980s, there was an idea that NATO should rely on the large-scale use of helicopters in an anti-tank and infantry mobility role. And those were actually explored during one of those Central Fortress seminars. Because of the complexity of defending Western Europe, again, from Norway to Turkey, with very different kind of terrain, climate, and defensive arrangements, General Alexander Haig, who was the SACEUR between 1974 and 1979, initiated in 1975 a series of exercises called Autumn Forge, which were designed to coordinate exercises held in the autumn period of the year in such a way that you would get as much interoperability and interaction among these various exercises.
So continue to talk about exercises.
Yeah.
We'd like to get kind of an idea of the breadth and scope of military exercise. So more specifically, what were they focused on besides just obviously an engagement
Yeah.
between the West? So were there humanitarian considerations, civil considerations, strategic communication considerations, and then even a process for de-escalation if necessary?
Right.
Were those some factors that were considered?
Sure. All of those factors were factored in one way or another. Remember that the Cold War went on for 4 decades. So the strategic context in which exercises were planned and designed changed over time. You had the Berlin and Cuba crisis in the early 1960s. You had détente in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And then you had new tensions with the Soviet Union from the mid-1970s onwards. All that changed the strategic thinking at the time, the operational concepts, and what you had to exercise during these various exercises and maneuvers and so on. Civil defense was a national responsibility, so that was mostly led by the individual nations. For instance, in the mid-1980s, the United Kingdom ran a large home defense exercise called Brave Defender, where they exercise their national resilience during wartime. NATO was very much aware that Soviet doctrine placed considerable importance on concealment and deception, what they call maskirovka in Russian. And we were aware of course, of the intended use of special forces, the Spetsnaz, to undertake covert sabotage operations. So a lot of these exercises try to look at how to defend and how to protect against those kinds of threats. There was a lot of concern by NATO and by the individual allies at the time over not disrupting the civilian economy during exercises, not disrupting merchant shipping at sea, civilian air traffic, all of that, as well as minimizing maneuver damage to roads and fields during those exercises. Most exercises were announced publicly, weeks, if not months, ahead of the occurrence. The media were invited to attend, for instance, opening ceremonies, for instance, at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, on the occasion of the arrival of U.S. Reforger troops. Some 17,000 troops came to Europe every year during exercise Reforger, and they were able to attend those ceremonies. They were also invited to observe the exercises. And for every exercise, NATO or the involved nations would set up a so-called Allied Press Information Center, APEC, where journalists would be given the opportunity to go and visit a particular exercise, and they would be escorted by public information officers. And this continues today. NATO had a large exercise, Steadfast Juncture 2018, held in Norway in late 2018, and that received considerable media coverage thanks to the arrangements afforded by SHAPE and by NATO more generally.
Yeah, Trident Juncture was a huge effort for all of us. It really was. To explain what it meant to take part in these exercises, we've asked two veterans of our podcast to give us their experience. General Franz Frengel and Colonel Adam Edmonds, here are their thoughts.
We did so many big exercises live that we can't do now because of the changed political and domestic environment. But that made us really proficient. I mean, there's barely an officer of my generation who doesn't now look back and think how embarrassing it was when I led that mechanized company, that armored, platoon down in a narrow little village in Germany, down a one-way street to a cul-de-sac at the far end, and in the middle of the night have the hoo-ha of trying to turn all the vehicles around to get back out again because you'd got yourself stuck. I mean, you really understood the friction of operating in a very real sense. What happens when you're leading an infantry regiment or a battalion through a rural area in the woods, and in the middle of the night, in the dark, the chain breaks and a soldier who's on his backpack, knackered, having marched 15 kilometers, falls asleep. The rest of the column moves off. Everybody's waiting for him to move off, but he's fast asleep and you can't see in the dark. And all of a sudden you have this friction, this problem to deal with. And we're not, I wonder whether we are able to do that now. That's the first. And the second is, of course, we knew who we were fighting. We knew who the adversary was. We could be somehow quite honest about it. And although we didn't label them Russians or anybody else, they were labelled the generic force. It was absolutely clear what equipment, what orbats, what tactics they were using that we could train against. So there was that sort of honesty, even though we masked it in a very superficial way. Now we're getting away from that, and I think we need to sort of rediscover that honesty, and it will help our training in that respect.
I was in as I said, platoon leader in Munich. And so we had to go 200 kilometers to our GDP, to our area of responsibility. It was close to Freyung in the Bavarian forest, somewhere between the Lusen and the Rachel mountain. And there was a main road coming from Prague. And this main road, which is a federal road today, this was the main effort. And this infantry battalion with the tank company was in the main effort of an infantry brigade. Our battalion supported. So we were subordinated to our battalion support brigade, and we were subordinated to one of the battalions. And there was one let's say, alibi, which shows you how we planned. The depth of the delay zone was in that terrain between 6 and 8 kilometers. And then defense began. And the battalion commander, to whom we were subordinated, told us, hey, I have a gap. That gap must be secured. This engineer company has, we had 21 machine guns and 21 bazookas and a lot of people, and you will accomplish that task. So we also went to a lot of infantry, tasks, and not only engineer tasks. And because of the fact that we were that our GDP was in Bavarian forest, what we also did with our soldiers to get them used to that kind of terrain and the extreme terrain, we had every year 1 week of training in the Alps in winter, and 1 week in summer. And in winter, sometimes it was really hard, but the soldiers went through that, and these soldiers were conscripts. All the families were concerned by that, and everybody had to think about that. Today, with the full professional armies, and I think that's the right way to do that, because with the complexity, it will be difficult to do it otherwise. We run into a situation that we have the armies as a kind of agency for exterior security. That is a company who's dealing with that. People are paid for that, etc., etc. So we have a dislink, and we might run into a dislink of of the population and of our society and the armed forces.
Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War was over. In a matter of months, the geopolitical scenario was radically changed. There was no Soviet Union. There was no Warsaw Pact. There was a new, unified Germany and several Central and Eastern European countries embracing democracy and market economy.
We will dedicate our next episode to the end of the Cold War. For now, it is important to mention that it was a very sudden change, and NATO was required to rethink its mission.
In the 1990s, the nature of military exercises changed. NATO took up a new role in peacekeeping and crisis management. The coming engagement in the Balkans revealed the need for different skill sets, tactics, and operations.
NATO also started to work closely with other actors, like the European Union and the United Nations, as well as with a variety of non-governmental organizations, in what is today known as a comprehensive approach to security.
Eli Ferrier, a leading expert in the field of NATO crisis management, explains how NATO reviewed its exercises in light of the new security environment in which it was operating.
We were politically directed to undertake a major review of exercising at that time, and there were two studies, both of which were called Right Mix and Right Mix 2. Right Mix 1 didn't exist, but Right Mix existed, followed then by another one, Right Mix 2, where there was a complete review of the, I think probably thousands of exercises in the NATO program at that time, to identify what was still necessary, what arguably could be merged or better handled, what was no longer necessary, and what, of course, or where could we save money. The peace dividend, I think, was talked about a lot in those days, and the idea that reducing exercise programs would throw up huge budgetary savings, arguably quite reasonable in that circumstance.
Another important issue of exercises in the post-Cold War era is the issue of decoupling nuclear weapons from military exercises. As NATO's role changed through time, new scenarios emerged in which nuclear weapons did not play a role. Again, Eli Ferrier explains.
So those still continued, but they were decoupled. The whole nuclear game, procedural exercises at the unit level, dare I say it, and all the way up the sort of command chain, command post exercising, and for that matter, didn't actually feature, in fact, actually in political exercises from the early 90s. But in the military field, of course, those were still conducted, but they were conducted separately by themselves and not related to any of the normal, dare I say it, sort of conventional exercise and programs that were now being retailored to meet the new environment.
Some think that hybrid warfare is a new concept, but this is not so. Hybrid warfare is a blend of conventional warfare tactics along with subversive efforts like misinformation and electronic warfare. The aim of these efforts is to create chaos and confusion and to undermine the enemy from within.
To tell us more about hybrid warfare in the Cold War and beyond, we asked Diego Ruiz Palmer for his thoughts.
There is sometimes the appearance that all this is new. In some of the ways the Russian hybrid warfare manifests itself is new. Ostensibly, cyber was not the kind of threat that it is today 40 years ago. But the emphasis that Soviet and now Russian doctrine have placed on concealment, deception, operating below the radar screen, ambiguity, creating uncertainty and anxiety, all that has been something that has been at the core of a lot of their thinking in terms of trying to surprise an adversary and create conditions for quick victories without many losses. And then that's something we need to worry about, that ability of other nations outside the alliance to create those kinds of hybrid threats.
So now assessing training exercises after the Cold War. So the Soviet Union collapses, the Berlin Wall comes down. In the post-Cold War era, how did training objectives shift? How did the planning and running of military exercises change in this new security environment?
Well, they change in a very significant way through the 1990s. For instance, NATO got engaged in the early 1990s in maritime interdiction operations in support of embargoes that had been mandated by the United Nations. NATO got involved in peace enforcement operations such as I-4 and S-4 in Bosnia and Herzegovina after the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement. I'm also referring to stabilization and security assistance operations in Afghanistan, for instance, in the early 2000s. Humanitarian assistance operations, for instance, extended to Albania when Albania was not yet an ally but was already a NATO partner. For all those kinds of operations, NATO forces had to be, in a way, to some degree, retooled and trained specifically for that, while at the same time still keeping a focus on high-end war-fighting skills. So it was a question of rebalancing the training and then adapting the exercises to be able to undertake those kinds of operations. Of course, NATO had in place the practices of multinational planning operations for 4 decades of the Cold War. So NATO knew how to put together a package of forces coming from different nations, all under a single command. And that remained very applicable to these new circumstances, but again, not for collective defense of NATO territory, this time to undertake these so-called non-Article 5 operations under either a UN mandate or the request and at the invitation of the affected country. In terms of operations, and NATO undertook over the last 25 years or so, some 40 different operations in Europe and beyond Europe. And all of them, again, required changing training patterns, develop new kinds of skills. We develop also linkages to non-NATO nations, our partners in Europe and outside Europe. Many of these nations contributed forces to these NATO operations and missions. And to that end, NATO developed a whole series of exercises in the cooperative series, and those were tailored to work with non-NATO nations. We also got engaged in the conduct of disaster relief exercises, for instance, to prepare for earthquakes or large forest fires. And those were undertaken by a special institution created under the umbrella of NATO, the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center. And this is a particular NATO partnership structure that conducts those kinds of preparations and exercises. Again, NATO was very able to develop those kinds of routines very efficiently. At the same time, we had to ensure that as we engage in more partnership with new nations that had not subscribed to NATO standards, that we allow them to build up to that kind of interoperability. And so we opened institutions like the NATO Defense College in Rome, the NATO School in Oberammergau in Germany, to the attendance of officers from all these nations so they could all operate on NATO standards and ensure that their forces would be interoperable with those of the allies.
Over the past 70 years, NATO's mission has evolved and changed, and so have the strategies and operations on the ground. Military exercises remain important ways to test the alliance's readiness, to reassure its members, and to project its strength. In our next episode, we discuss the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and how NATO adapted to keep its members safe. We'd like to thank all of our guests who appeared on this episode, and as always, a special shout out to mass communication specialist Brett Dodge for being our producer, and to Paul Magus and the NATO Public Diplomacy Division team for opening their recording studio to us. Please visit our website for show notes, sources, and links to the biographies of our guests. Thank you to all of you for listening, and tune in to our next episode.